Joe,
Yep.
Wow, a lot to get through this morning.
A lot to get through, a lot more questions still out there than answers. It was fascinating. Yesterday was fascinating. I think really the most remarkable thing about yesterday was the fact that a man who had had the respect of attorneys on both sides of the aisles over the past 30, 40 years, the Attorney General Barr, humiliated himself, shamed himself by just a pathetic performance. And I'm not so sure that he didn't do that. I'm not so sure he didn't do that to gain actually the sort of notoriety that he got yesterday. He took the heat from Donald Trump. And you'll notice yesterday, half of the talk was about what Barr did. And a lot of pundits couldn't focus long enough on what Donald Trump did. Dan Balso, with the Washington Post, summed it up fairly well. The 448-page document is replete with evidence of repeated lying by public officials and others, some who've been charged for that conduct, of the president urging them not to tell the truth, of the president seeking to shut down the investigation, of a Trump campaign hoping to benefit politically from Russian hacking and leaks of information damaging to its opponent, and of a White House in chaos and operating under abnormal rules. Now, Willie, the politician in me says that the Democrats need to keep their head down, focus on, issues that are going to matter around the dinner table of Americans, and just win the election in 2020 if they want to get rid of a man who obviously is unfit to be president of the United States. But you see, here's the rub. They also have a constitutional responsibility to follow the rule of law. And this Mueller report documents explicitly that he obstructed justice. And Robert Mueller even said in the report, of course, William Barr lied. That's just what he does now. But he said in the report, listen, I can't come to this conclusion. Congress, this has to be up to you. So the Democrats have a choice. Are they going to play it safe? Are they going to do what polls would tell you will actually get Donald Trump removed from office in an election? Or will they begin the impeachment proceedings that this Mueller report suggests Donald Trump deserves? He is unfit to be president of the United States, and anybody who suggests otherwise has not read the report.
When that debate among Democrats began almost immediately yesterday, you had some congresswomen and men talking instantly about impeachment, saying what I've read in these 2 volumes of the Mueller report constitutes grounds to begin the impeachment process. Others pumping the brakes on that. You had Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler came out pretty quickly and said, let's go through the process. I want to have Bob Mueller sit before our committee. I want to have William Barr, as is planned, to sit before this committee. But as you said, Joe, starting with the morning, I think the Attorney General William Barr went even further and was more aggressively partisan than we could have even predicted yesterday as we sat here before, as he made the case and said no collusion, no collusion, no collusion, and selectively spoke about some of the top lines in the report. Before that report was released, William Barr did attempt to shape the public's perception by excusing the president's behavior detailed within it.
President Trump faced an unprecedented situation. As he entered into office and sought to perform his responsibilities as president, federal agents and prosecutors were scrutinizing his conduct before and after taking office and the conduct of some of his associates. At the same time, there was relentless speculation in the news media about the president's personal culpability. Yet, as he said from the beginning, there was, in fact, no collusion.
Here's the quote from page 2 of volume 1 of the Mueller report. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. We should say that right from the beginning. That's what Bob Mueller said. They couldn't find evidence of a conspiracy. But Mueller did write, while the investigation identified numerous links between individuals with ties to the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign, the evidence was not sufficient to support criminal charges. Moreover, we now have the rest of the sentence fragment in Barr's March March 24th letter that said the investigation, quote, did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Barr left out the less flattering beginning of that sentence that read, the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. So, Joe, you have Bob Mueller saying pretty clearly on page 2 there that the investigation could not establish a conspiracy. But William Barr's characterization in the March 24th letter and his characterization before was completely off base.
No, completely off base. It is what William Rehnquist once wrote in an opinion, was retching words from their proper context. That's exactly what Barr did yesterday, like any political hack would do. He is not an attorney general in the common sense of the word. He is a political hack. I think John Heilemann, another thing that yesterday establishes is that when this presidency is over, John Mitchell will not be sitting alone as the worst attorney general in modern American political history. Right. He will be side by side by William Barr. I want to say, though, how ridiculous for Barr to try to excuse Donald Trump's obstruction of justice, for Barr to try to excuse Donald Trump running around telling people to fire the special counsel, telling people to lie to investigators, to all the things that he did because he was angry, he was frustrated because of political enemies. I mean, my gosh, listen, I voted to impeach Bill Clinton twice. One on obstruction of justice, abuse of power. What Bill Clinton was charged for? I mean, again, we're talking about lying before a grand jury, lying in a deposition about his personal life, so pales in comparison to what Lindsey Graham, who prosecuted that case in the Senate, to what Lindsey Graham now excuses every day of the week. It is shameful. And Republicans like myself were going after Bill Clinton from day one. So that's no excuse. What about Mitch McConnell, before Barack Obama even got elected president of the United States, saying that his only focus was making Barack Obama a one-term president? They were going after, I mean, what Barr said, it was akin to a mother saying, please forgive Joey for not turning in his homework. The dog ate it. Right. No excuse at all.
Well, right. You know, can you imagine, Joe, back in your day, Bill Clinton had said, well, you know, I lied to the grand jury and I lied to the special counsel because I was frustrated over the way that Republicans treated me on health care. I mean, I think it's being too nice to Barr, I think, to say that he is a political hack. It's something that we've discussed on the show before. I obviously agree with that. But worse than just trying to spin the report yesterday is that he just blatantly lied about it in a variety of ways, knowing presumably that he was going to get found out for that lie, which kind of elevates it to the thing you were discussing before, which I think is what's the strategy? What's the game that Barr was playing? Because he had to know he was going to be exposed. And when I say he lied about it, I mean in a couple very distinct ways, one of which is the thing Willie just alluded to. You know, the no collusion mantra, it's not that the report found no collusion. It's that the report explicitly says we reject the notion of collusion as meaningful. It says it right there on the page. It says collusion's not a meaningful term. We weren't trying to figure that out. We were focused on a much narrower definition, a very specific thing of what constitutes coordination and conspiracy. And yet Barr is saying, attributing to Mueller and the report, that it found no collusion. Again, as I said, the report says that's not what's at issue. The second really compelling thing that goes to this obstruction piece is that Barr yesterday essentially said, Rod Rosenstein and I looked at what Mueller wrote here, the evidence of obstruction, which was not definitive in the report for various reasons we'll get into. But he said, you know, he didn't make a determination. So Rod Rosenstein and I decided that he hadn't obstructed justice. And the reason was that we weighed very heavily the fact that the White House cooperated fully with the special counsel. And yet the special counsel's report is 448 pages of details of the way in which Donald Trump did not cooperate fully with the special counsel and lied to the special counsel, had other people lie to the special counsel, refused to testify to the special counsel. The report is a giant buffet of examples of studied non-cooperation, yet Barr is saying the reason that we didn't find obstruction was that Trump was cooperative. That, to me, there's no other word for it other than it's a bald-faced lie, and that's why I think you're right about the place in history that Bill Barr has now earned himself, which is pretty ignominious.
Well, I mean, one lie after another. And Benjamin Wittes, why don't we move beyond Barr? Because he's made himself really irrelevant to the discussion, irrelevant to history. He is now a hack of Donald Trump. And that's how history will paint him. Let's talk instead about the Mueller report, what we know about it so far. Obviously, still redacted. There are still redacted parts that need to be unredacted. But talk about the Mueller report, what you saw in it, what stood out, and what Congress has to work with now moving forward.
Yeah, so I mean, there are still redactions, but I think there are actually fewer of them, and they are less substantial than a lot of people believed they would be. And the result is that we actually very much do know what Bob Mueller said, and he created a mammoth record on two fronts. So the first, of course, is the Russia investigation itself, where, as you guys have been talking about, I mean, he did not find prosecutable conspiracy beyond that which he had already found, which was, of course, substantial. But he did detail more than 100 pages. It's literally more than 100 pages of contacts, probes, recruitment efforts by Russians toward people associated with the Trump organization and campaign. And these included everything from his business to the campaign itself. And, you know, I think there's a legitimate claim whenever a criminal investigation closes, hey, the criminal investigation is over. But this material, as a factual matter, is now part of history and part of the political assessment and the fitness assessment of Donald Trump. The second area, which is probably more immediate because it deals more with Trump's personal conduct and less with the people around him, is this unbelievable record that Mueller created on obstruction. And, you know, I don't think any summary of it or talk about it on a show like this can entirely do it justice. I really think people need to spend the time to, if only read the executive summary of it, but to actually look at the document and ask yourself, is this okay? Right? Is it okay to have a president who interacts with the law enforcement and intelligence apparatus of the country, his own staff with respect to those communities, and the law itself in the fashion in which this is depicting the president doing? This is conduct as president, in his capacity as president. And I do think it will have a very long tail. I don't know how the political system is going to react to it. I do think it will have a very long tail in terms of the way people understand who this man is.
Well, and that brings to mind the quote in the report by the president himself, Joe, where he says, I'm, you know what, because it does actually spell everything out, all of his conduct, all of his behavior, all the things that, you know, weren't completely confirmed. Even Sarah Sanders lying, flat out, bold-faced, lying to the media is now out in the open. This presidency is different now.
The president's saying, oh, my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. How he responded to finding out that Robert Mueller had been appointed obviously goes to intent of him trying to obstruct justice. A
lot of things.
Throughout the entire last 2.5 years. You also look at the 100 pages that Benjamin just talked about. Remarkable. 100 pages of contacts. And then you just go back and look at a clip from the campaign where Donald Trump says, nobody connected with me, nobody in my organization has had any contacts with Russia. It's one lie after another lie after another lie. But, you know, obstruction, in effect, couldn't ultimately be proven by Robert Mueller because he could never get Donald Trump to come sit down with him voluntarily. And Chuck, that goes to you, Chuck Rosenberg. A lot of people asking yesterday why Robert Mueller did not push for that. I understand he says it would have delayed it. I must say, it makes no sense to me at all that he didn't subpoena him. I can't read the minds of the Supreme Court justices, but I find it hard to believe that there were not at least 6, 7 votes that would go Robert Mueller's way, deciding that a president is not above the law. So why didn't Robert Mueller push for that face-to-face deposition and have the answers that America needs?
Yeah, that's an open question for me, Joe. In the report, what the Mueller team says is twofold. One is that they had lots of other stuff that enabled them to gauge credibility. And two, they were worried that if they did subpoena the president, it could lead to a protracted fight. All that said...
Well, let me ask you about the second one, though. I mean, I heard 3 years. It could delay it 3 years. I mean, the Supreme Court would have expedited a hearing on this. It wouldn't have taken that long, would it?
Well, no, I don't think so. And moreover, in U.S. v. Nixon, the 1974 case on executive privilege, in which the president was required to turn over tapes and documents pursuant to subpoena, I believe the amount of time from subpoena to Supreme Court decision was about 4 or 5 months. So it's an open question for me. There could be another plausible explanation. Mueller didn't mention this, but if a target of an investigation signals to you through his or her attorneys that they would invoke the Fifth Amendment, their privilege against self-incrimination, if subpoenaed to the grand jury, you would not then subpoena that person to the grand jury and make them invoke there. Now, Mueller doesn't mention that, frankly, nor should he talk about a Fifth Amendment invocation in a public report. That's the only other thing I can think of, but I can tell you as a prosecutor, you always want to talk to the subject. You always want to talk to the target. You don't always get
Chuck,
the chance.
Chuck, help me out here. If the president can't, if everybody's operating under, I believe, the faulty assumption that the president cannot be indicted, and if the president's lawyers are operating under that assumption, and Robert Mueller is operating under that assumption, which I believe, again, is a bizarre assumption in a land where we believe that no man or woman is above the law. How could anybody be allowed to use their Fifth Amendment rights if you can't be indicted anyway?
Yeah, well, so the policy, Joe, and let's just take it as, as written, you can't charge a sitting president. The key word there is sitting, right? So he would still theoretically have a Fifth Amendment privilege because one day, guess what?
Right.
He will no longer be a sitting president and he could be charged.
Michael Schmidt,
You've
covered every twist and turn of this report and this story from the beginning. In fact, broke a lot of the news that turned up in the report. So I'm interested in your broad stroke thoughts on what you read yesterday, but specifically on the question of obstruction. One quote jumped out at me. It reads, "The president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or to cede to his requests." In other words, time and again, Donald Trump, who was obsessed, the president of the United States, with this investigation, wanted to have Bob Mueller fired, despite his claims that that never happened. But people like Don McGahn, the White House counsel, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, and even Corey Lewandowski sort of stood in the breach and prevented that from happening.
Yeah, they were really guardrails for the president and stopped him. And if had they followed through on these things, there may be a much stronger obstruction case to be made against the president. The interesting thing about this document is that the reason that there is so much damaging political stuff there for the president, even if it's not criminal, is that Donald Trump decided himself to cooperate with this investigation, and he opened the door for his aides to go and speak with Mueller. And that's how they learned all these things. The reason that you have unfiltered Donald Trump in there is because you had direct access to his lawyer, Don McGahn. And the president okayed that. The president okayed McGahn's cooperation. And I'm not sure that the White House at the time understood the depth and breadth of what McGahn knew. They had looked at the documents that the White House had handed over to Mueller and thought that there were no problems. But a lot of the stuff that McGahn gave up was not in the documents, and it is politically damaging. It is this stuff about Trump's attempt to fire Mueller and the lengths that McGahn went to stop that. And while the White House today, you know, there was a report earlier about how the president may not be very happy with Don McGahn. Well, the reason the stuff is there is because the president allowed McGahn to go in, and he didn't want to put up a fight to stop that in the way that he could have.
But, you know, also, you had the Mueller report talking about, Willie, that they couldn't prove certain charges beyond a reasonable doubt because there had been destruction of emails, destruction of messages on app devices that just didn't allow them to get there. But Chuck Rosenberg, I think I heard you say something about this yesterday. Whenever I hear anybody say that there was an obstruction of justice, that he's cleared of obstruction of justice, I just apply these facts and this fact pattern to what would happen if a mayor in Iowa had done this, if a governor in Nebraska had done this, or Illinois had done this, or if any CEO, I believe you said, if any Fortune 500 CEO had told his board members that he wanted them to interfere with an investigation one half of the way that Donald Trump did, they would be sitting in jail today, would they not, Chuck?
That's what I said, Joe, and here's how I framed it. Read the report, but take out the words Trump and President of the United States and substitute, Smith and bank CEO or any title that you want. If that person did, if any person on the planet did what is described in this report, and again, strip it of Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, left, right, take all that out, just read the facts, they would be in handcuffs yesterday. This is a damning report. It outlines a compelling case of obstruction of justice, but for the fact that Donald Trump is the President of the United States, he would be charged with a crime. That simple.
Well, and in that line where the president says, I didn't see it as he's going to jail. He's going to definitely be completely tied together with collusion. That all may happen, by the way, when he leaves office. But I knew that he would be exposed. His practices, his horrific behavior would all be exposed. And another thing that we see in this report is something we've seen before exposed in this presidency, and that is more evidence that for this presidency to function, people have to undermine it. His own staff has to not regard his wishes, not take his orders in order to survive and in order to do the right thing.
You know, America was actually spared by the fact of a full-blown constitutional crisis from the fact that he's such a weak leader.
Right.
That even his subordinates don't respect him and ignore his orders.
Too dumb to collude. Everyone, stay with us. We're just getting started. President Trump may feel exonerated, but his press secretary was just humiliated.
Along with him.
Sarah Sanders is forced to admit what everyone knows. She lies to the American people. Her shameful admission is just ahead. Plus, the must-read opinion page's George Conway says the facts in the Mueller report are even more damning than the report's refusal to clear Trump of a crime. We'll read from that piece just ahead. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.